January 1945. A thin veil of winter mist clings to the Atlantic as the U.S. Army transport ship eases toward the eastern coastline of the United States. Standing on the open deck, hands cuffed loosely, overcoats stiff from sea salt, are some of the highest-ranking German officers captured in the closing months of the war. Generals who once commanded divisions and corps across Europe now stare silently at a world they had only known through propaganda and reports. The coastline grows clearer. Wide highways, tall cranes, steaming factories, and clusters of homes stretch farther than they expected. No ruins. No ration lines. No bombed-out districts. Just an unbroken horizon of industry and confidence. Some of the generals exchange brief glances. A few tighten their jaws. Others look down, trying to reconcile what stands before them with the vision of America they were taught to despise. For the first time, many feel a quiet unease, an understanding that the enemy they faced was larger, stronger, and far more modern than they ever imagined. And as the ship continues toward the harbor, the reality of this new world begins to settle over them, setting the stage for everything that follows next. By late 1944, the Third Reich was crumbling. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army pressed relentlessly toward Berlin, while in the West, Allied forces had crossed into German territory after the Normandy landings. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines were fractured, and morale among German troops had plummeted. The Wehrmacht, once the symbol of invincibility, was retreating under overwhelming pressure. High-ranking officers, generals, admirals, and Luftwaffe commanders found themselves isolated, captured, or forced to surrender. The capture of these senior officers was not only a military victory but also an intelligence opportunity. The Allies recognized that understanding the inner workings of the German command could provide insights into strategy, logistics, and ideology. The United States, bound by the Geneva Convention, was required to treat prisoners humanely, but it also implemented specialized programs for elite captives. Select generals were transferred to secure, segregated camps where interrogations were methodical, structured, and thorough. These men were far from ordinary soldiers. They were the architects of campaigns that had devastated Europe, and their knowledge was invaluable. Camps like Fort Hunt in Virginia and Camp Shanks in New York were designed to accommodate officers with both comfort and security in mind. While basic Geneva-compliant facilities were provided, the true focus was observation. American military intelligence monitored their reactions, conversations, and interactions, recording every detail that could illuminate German military thought. Transporting these officers across the Atlantic was a deliberate decision. By moving them away from Europe, the U.S. minimized the risk of escape or rescue while exposing them to an environment that challenged everything they believed about the world and the enemy. The Americans understood the psychological dimension as well. Seeing a functioning society untouched by the war, generals who had once wielded enormous authority were forced to confront the limitations of their power. It was a calculated move, a combination of security, intelligence gathering, and controlled exposure to the American way of life, a world far removed from the propaganda they had absorbed for years. These measures laid the foundation for one of the most intriguing intersections of military history and human psychology. The elite German POWs encountering America for the first time, unfiltered and entirely real. Once selected for transfer, the generals faced a journey as controlled and scrutinized as their eventual internment. In early 1945, specially assigned U.S. Army transports departed from ports such as Le Havre and Antwerp, carrying groups of high-ranking German prisoners under tight security. Armed escorts, naval convoys, and strict routines ensured that the risk of escape or sabotage was minimized. The crossings were long and tense. Officers confined to decks or cabins could only speculate about the land they were approaching, their imaginations shaped by years of wartime propaganda. The generals themselves represented a wide spectrum of backgrounds. Some had served in panzer divisions, directing armored warfare across France and the Eastern Front. Others had overseen Luftwaffe operations, responsible for the air campaigns that had once dominated the skies of Europe. Intelligence officers among them had spent years in clandestine operations, while career Wehrmacht leaders had long histories of tactical innovation. Ideologically, They ranged from staunch National Socialists to professional soldiers whose loyalty was primarily to Germany rather than the Nazi Party. Expectations of America were often starkly idealized or entirely false. Propaganda had painted the United States as decadent, weak, or morally corrupt. Some officers anticipated seeing chaos, racial tensions, or societal collapse. What awaited them, however, were orderly ports, efficient logistics, and civilians moving freely through bustling streets, a stark contrast to the devastation they had left behind in Europe. Factories hummed, railways ran on schedule, and the very scale of industrial production was overwhelming. The U.S. military anticipated these reactions and planned accordingly. Escape attempts were considered unlikely but not impossible. Elite POWs, accustomed to planning operations, were seen as potentially dangerous if left unsupervised. Camps were constructed with layered security, fences, armed guards, controlled access points, and constant observation. Interrogators and intelligence officers carefully monitored interactions, noting patterns of leadership, morale, and ideology. Each step of the journey, from embarkation to arrival, was orchestrated to protect both American personnel and the psychological impact of exposure to the American homeland. By the time the transports approached the American coastline, the generals were caught between anticipation and disbelief. They had left a world in flames and now confronted one of abundance, order, and modernity. For the first time, many began to realize that the enemy they had underestimated was more formidable than they had imagined, and that their own understanding. For the first time, the generals were no longer commanders but observers, outsiders in a world they had imagined from a distance. Stepping off the transport, many froze, eyes scanning the streets and ports. The scale of American cities was staggering. Wide roads, orderly traffic, and uninterrupted rows of houses challenged every expectation they had formed from wartime reports. Factories emitted constant smoke, assembly lines moved with precise rhythm, and the hum of machinery filled the air. Cars, trucks, and trains seemed endless, each a testament to productivity far beyond what Germany could muster in its shattered state. Human reactions varied. Some generals remained stoic, trying to maintain the composure befitting their rank, yet their eyes betrayed disbelief. Others muttered under their breath, scanning everything with a mix of awe and apprehension. A few slumped against railings, quietly absorbing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Conversations among themselves revealed fragments of astonishment, comments on cleanliness, efficiency, and the apparent prosperity of ordinary citizens. For many, it was an unspoken confrontation with failure. The enemy was not just surviving, it was thriving. The technological and industrial contrast was equally stark. German officers who had prided themselves on their own nation's engineering now compared it to a landscape of unparalleled American efficiency. Factories repaired themselves quickly, trains arrived on schedule, and the production of food, vehicles, and weapons appeared inexhaustible. The bombed-out cities they had fled were a memory of scarcity, ruin, and desperate improvisation. Here, machinery and manpower were harmonized, creating an almost unstoppable momentum. Some generals quietly noted these observations, understanding that production capacity had been as decisive in the conflict as battlefield tactics. Even the simplest aspects of modern life, the flow of electricity, the scale of supermarkets, the presence of civilian freedom, were shocking. The generals were forced to confront a reality that their propaganda-fueled imaginations could not encompass. Each glance, each note taken in memory, was a piece of evidence against the myths they had grown up believing. The human experience and technological reality merged, awe and disbelief, admiration and frustration. For these men, this was not just a physical journey across the Atlantic, it was a confrontation with a world they had been taught to fear, one that revealed both their limitations and the depth of their miscalculations. The psychological impact on the generals was profound. For decades, Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as decadent, weak, and morally corrupt. Now, standing in orderly streets and bustling ports, the prestige they once associated with their own power seemed hollow. They were confronted not by chaos but by efficiency, organization, and confidence, a quiet yet undeniable superiority. Some officers experienced a sense of personal humiliation, realizing that the myth of German invincibility had been shattered long before the final battles. From a military and tactical perspective, the Americans' logistical prowess was impossible to ignore. Generals walked along railways, studied ports, and observed supply depots, noting the staggering scale of manpower and machinery. Even without engaging in combat, they could see why Germany had faltered. Production outstripped their destruction, reserves were abundant, and organizational systems were superior. Many scribbled mental notes, acknowledging in private that the war's outcome was determined not solely by strategy but by the industrial and operational capacity of the United States. Beyond practical assessment came moral and ideological disillusionment. Officers who had once embraced Nazi ideology, or at least adhered to it unquestioningly, now confronted a crisis of belief. The American cities, operating without fear of daily bombardment, contrasted starkly with Germany's devastation. The ideals they had once defended, racial supremacy, militaristic dominance, unquestioning loyalty, began to feel hollow when juxtaposed with the tangible success of a society built on innovation and civic order. Some quietly questioned the legitimacy of the causes they had served, experiencing an internal reckoning that would linger long after repatriation. Together, these angles, human reaction, technological contrast, psychological shock, tactical observation, and moral disillusionment, paint a layered picture of the general's first encounter with America. It was not a single revelation but a cascade of realizations, each more destabilizing than the last. In these moments, the elite officers began to understand why the Third Reich had failed, and why their perception of the enemy had been so fundamentally flawed. The generals disembarked under a gray morning sky at ports that were as orderly as they were heavily guarded. From there, they were transported to high-security POW facilities, Camp Roosevelt in New York, Fort Hunt in Virginia, and other select installations designed specifically for elite captives. These camps were a study in controlled efficiency, surrounded by fences, observation towers, and armed guards, yet meticulously maintained to reflect American standards of comfort and order. Their first interrogations began almost immediately. American intelligence officers approached methodically, asking questions about troop deployments, strategic planning, and logistical systems. The generals responded with the discipline and caution that had defined their careers, but subtle observations were recorded at every step. Guards noted eye movements, hesitations, and even the tone of voice, each reaction a fragment of insight into the mindset of men who had once commanded thousands. As days passed, the weight of observation began to press. Tours of local infrastructure, factories, and transportation hubs revealed a reality the generals could not deny. The scale of production, the precision of supply chains, and the speed with which goods moved through American society were staggering. Tanks, planes, and vehicles were produced in numbers that Germany could never have matched. Even the simplest commodities, bread, clothing, medical supplies, flowed freely. For many, the realization was chilling: Germany could never have equaled the American wartime output. No amount of tactical genius could compensate for the sheer material superiority they now witnessed firsthand. Conversations between officers became quieter, more reflective. The veneer of invincibility that had been carefully maintained for years was crumbling, replaced by a dawning understanding of the imbalance that had determined the war's outcome. These early days at the camps marked a pivotal moment, not just in the war's narrative but in the internal world of the generals themselves. For the first time, they were forced to confront the gap between myth and reality, between ideology and fact, and between ambition and capability. As the weeks progressed, the psychological transformation became unmistakable. The generals, once symbols of authority and mastery over warfare, found themselves stripped of influence, navigating a world that both bewildered and humbled them. Simple routines, shopping excursions, supervised travel within the camp perimeters, visits to American towns, exposed them to freedoms and abundance they had never imagined. Clean streets, stocked supermarkets, and the hum of civilian life contrasted sharply with the devastated, rationed, and regimented landscapes of post-war Germany. American intelligence officers documented every nuance. Reports note generals lingering at the entrances of stores, eyes tracing shelves of goods, fingers brushing items they had only heard of in passing. Railways ran precisely on schedule, ports functioned without delay, and workers executed their tasks with discipline and autonomy. Even more unsettling were the glimpses of civil liberties, freedom of speech, movement, and assembly. For officers who had served in a tightly controlled authoritarian system, it was a revelation and a blow to pride. Testimonies from POWs reveal quiet conversations among themselves. One general, later recorded in an official report, murmured about the impossibility of mobilizing Germany to match this scale. Another admitted privately to U.S. interrogators that the Reich's war propaganda had concealed the true magnitude of the enemy's resources. The ideological armor they had worn for years began to crack. Some officers remarked on contradictions in American society, the coexistence of racial inequality with functional democracy. Yet even these disparities could not diminish the overall impression: the United States was a force far beyond what they had anticipated. By the end of their initial months in America, most generals had arrived at the same unspoken conclusion. They could no longer envision a scenario in which Germany could have outproduced, outmaneuvered, or outlasted the United States. The strategic impossibility of German victory was no longer theoretical. It was visible, tangible, and unavoidable. The moment was quiet but profound. The once proud commanders had been confronted with undeniable evidence of their nation's limits, and in that confrontation, the narrative of German supremacy finally fractured. Time in American custody reshaped the generals in ways both subtle and profound. Removed from the collapsing Third Reich and immersed in an unfamiliar society, many began to reassess their understanding of war, leadership, and ideology. Daily exposure to efficient administration, functioning industry, and relative freedom forced them to confront the limitations of their own military system. What had once seemed like insurmountable American myths became tangible realities: roads filled with cars, factories humming with production, and civilians exercising liberties that were unheard of in wartime Germany. This environment fostered a degree of cooperation with U.S. interrogators that went beyond mere compliance. Officers, once fiercely loyal to their country and rank, began sharing insights on strategy, logistics, and the inner workings of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Their expertise was methodically documented, providing the Allies with valuable intelligence on operational methods, supply chains, and decision-making processes. Interactions were not purely transactional. Some generals engaged in extended discussions about military philosophy, tactics, and the mistakes that had led to Germany's defeat. The phenomenon of the intellectual POW emerged during this period. These were officers who, removed from the immediate pressures of combat, applied critical thinking to assess both the Allied forces and the failures of their own military hierarchy. They analyzed, debated, and sometimes challenged their own assumptions, creating a unique dynamic between captor and captive. While the security apparatus remained vigilant, the Americans recognized that this cooperation was a rare opportunity to understand not just the technical aspects of German operations but also the mindset of elite military leadership. By the time their internment reached its midpoint, the generals had experienced a profound psychological shift. Awe had been replaced by reflection, fear by understanding, and rigidity by cautious openness. The American experiment, exposing elite POWs to the realities of a functioning society, had succeeded in reshaping perceptions, establishing both the limitations of the German war effort and the adaptability of its senior officers under controlled conditions. By late 1945 and early 1946, the transfer of generals back to Germany began. The return was measured and deliberate. Officers arrived to a homeland scarred by destruction, occupation, and the psychological weight of defeat. For many, the shock of seeing America firsthand remained vivid, an indelible memory that framed their understanding of the war's outcome. Discussions with fellow returning officers often centered on the contrast between the destroyed cities of Germany and the thriving, orderly society they had witnessed overseas. Their experiences in U.S. custody left a lasting imprint on post-war military thought. Many of these officers, now civilians or advisors, influenced the early development of the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new defense force. Tactical doctrines, logistical planning, and approaches to training reflected lessons learned both on the battlefield and from observing American efficiency. The exposure to organized, large-scale operations and technological advancement helped shape a generation of military professionals who value both strategic pragmatism and operational precision. Beyond formal military influence, their stories began to circulate within post-war German society. Interviews, memoirs, and declassified intelligence reports revealed the psychological journey of men who had once served the Third Reich but were confronted with an entirely new reality. Tales of awe, disbelief, and eventual acknowledgement of German limitations offered a window into the gap between wartime propaganda and the lived experience of the broader world. These narratives, often cautious and measured, challenged simplified myths of heroism and invincibility, encouraging a more reflective, critical engagement with the past. The shock experienced by the generals underscored a broader truth: ideology, propaganda, and battlefield valor were insufficient against the overwhelming power of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and organizational discipline. Their first-hand encounters with America demonstrated that the defeat of Germany was as much a product of systemic disadvantage as it was of tactical or strategic failure. In retrospect, the journey of these elite POWs became emblematic of the limits of human ambition when confronted with the realities of modern warfare. The first sight of America was more than a physical journey; it was a confrontation with reality itself. For the German generals, accustomed to the carefully constructed narratives of Nazi propaganda, the bustling cities, orderly streets, and humming factories of the United States shattered illusions that had long shaped their worldview. The experience revealed the fragility of perception, how ideology could distort truth, inflate fears, and obscure the scale of the world beyond one's own borders. In those moments of silent observation, the generals confronted the limits of their own power. The vastness of American industry, the efficiency of its logistics, and the resilience of its civilian society underscored a simple yet profound truth: the outcome of the war was determined not solely on the battlefield, but by the resources, organization, and capacity of nations to sustain conflict. Pride, rank, and past victories could not alter that reality. This encounter became a symbolic turning point in their understanding, both of the war and of themselves. It highlighted the consequences of living within an echo chamber of propaganda and the stark contrast between imagined enemies and tangible truth. Some found humility, others disillusionment, yet all were forced to reconcile with the undeniable superiority they had witnessed. In the quiet aftermath, the story of these generals serves as a reminder of the power of first-hand experience to pierce ideology, the inevitability of confronting truth in the face of evidence, and the enduring lesson that understanding often comes not from victory or defeat, but from seeing the world as it truly is.